Woman shares her last piece of bread with a homeless man in Chicago, not knowing he is a disguised millionaire. Days later, she receives an unexpected surprise. Janice Bowens stared at the loaf of bread on the counter, her hands trembling slightly as she sliced it into thin pieces. She calculated silently in her mind, wondering how to stretch it into a meal that could keep her children satisfied, even for one night. In the living room, Elizabeth, her youngest, hummed a tune she had made up, completely immersed in her world as she arranged small toys into a makeshift tea party. Her older brother, Dwayne, carefully balanced wooden blocks, building a tower while giving Elizabeth tips in his usual patient tone. Janice watched them from the kitchen, her heart aching with both pride and despair. They were her purpose, the reason she found the strength to keep going despite the endless challenges. But tonight, like so many others, she felt the crushing weight of not having enough. A sudden knock on the door startled her, breaking her thoughts. Janice glanced at the clock, confused. She wasn't expecting anyone. Wiping her hands on her apron, she walked cautiously toward the door and opened it just a crack. Standing in the hallway was a man, thin and disheveled, his clothes worn and hanging loosely on his frame. His face was pale, with a gauntness that hinted at hunger and exhaustion. But it was his eyes, an intense, weary blue, that caught Janice's attention. They carried a depth of sadness, but also a flicker of something she couldn't place. "Excuse me," he began, his voice hoarse and hesitant. "I don't mean to bother you, but do you have any food to spare?" Janice froze for a moment, glancing back over her shoulder at the table where her children's dinner, barely enough to be called a meal, waited. Her first instinct was to apologize and shut the door. She didn't have enough for her own family, let alone for a stranger. But something about the man stopped her. His eyes held a vulnerability she couldn't ignore, as if he'd been asking for help for a long time and had learned to expect disappointment. "Just a moment," she said softly, opening the door wider. "Come in. It's cold out there." The man hesitated, surprise flashing across his face, before stepping inside. He moved slowly, as if unsure he was truly welcome. Janice guided him toward the kitchen, her mind racing. Her children had stopped their play and were now peeking cautiously from the living room, their wide eyes fixed on the stranger. "What's your name?" Janice asked as she reached for a plate. "Mike," he replied, his voice almost breaking as he spoke. "Thank you. I mean it. I didn't know where else to go." "Janice," she said simply, setting the plate on the table. "Those are my kids, Dwayne and Elizabeth." She gestured toward the two, who waved shyly before retreating slightly behind the doorway. Janice took the loaf of bread she had been slicing and divided it into 3 portions instead of 2. It wasn't much, barely enough for anyone, but it was all she had to give. She spread a thin layer of butter on each piece to make it feel more substantial, though she doubted it would fool anyone. "Here," she said, placing the plate in front of Mike. "You don't have to do this," he murmured, his hands hovering over the plate as if he couldn't believe it was meant for him. "Everyone needs help sometimes," Janice replied, taking a seat across from him. Mike ate slowly, savoring each bite, though it was clear he was starving. As he ate, Dwayne and Elizabeth emerged from their hiding spot and joined the table. Dwayne broke the silence, his curiosity getting the better of him. "Why are you here?" he asked, his tone more curious than accusatory. "Dwayne," Janice said gently, but Mike gave a small smile. "It's okay," he said. I've been going through a rough time. Lost my job. Lost my place to stay. It's been hard finding work again." Elizabeth tilted her head, her young mind trying to process his words. "Do you have kids?" she asked. "No," Mike replied, his smile fading slightly. "I don't." Dwayne leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "So, where do you sleep?" Janice moved to hush him, but Mike answered honestly. "Wherever I can. Shelters, mostly. Sometimes outside." The room fell quiet for a moment. Even Elizabeth, usually full of chatter, seemed lost in thought. "You can stay here for a little while," she offered suddenly, her voice small but earnest. Janice felt a lump in her throat. "Elizabeth, honey." Mike interrupted with a wave of his hand. "That's very kind of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "but I don't want to be a burden." As the meal came to an end, Mike stood to leave. He lingered at the door, turning back to Janice with an expression of deep gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "You didn't have to let me in, but you did. You didn't have to share your food, but you did. I'll never forget that kindness." Janice gave him a small smile, though her heart felt heavy. "Take care of yourself, Mike," she said softly. He nodded, his eyes lingering on her for a moment before he disappeared into the hallway. For a long time after the door closed, Janice stood there, her hand still resting on the doorknob. There was something about Mike that stayed with her, a sense that their paths had crossed for a reason, though she couldn't quite explain why. When she finally returned to the kitchen, Dwayne looked up at her. "Mom," he asked, his voice quiet, "is he going to be okay?" Janice knelt down beside him, brushing a hand through his hair. "I hope so, sweetheart," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I really hope so." As she cleaned up the table and prepared her children for bed, Janice couldn't shake the feeling that the night had been the beginning of something she didn't yet understand. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to wonder what might come next. 2 days after Mike's visit, Janice sat at the kitchen table, sorting through a small pile of mail. Most of it was as she expected: bills, advertisements, and more bills. But one envelope stood out. It was stark white, heavy in her hands, with a return address embossed in gold letters: Anderson Enterprises. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the text formal and precise. "Dear Ms. Bowens, you are cordially invited to a meeting at Anderson Enterprises. Please join us at our headquarters on address, on date and time. Sincerely, Anderson Enterprises." Janice read it once. Then again. And again. The words didn't make sense. She hadn't applied for any jobs, and certainly not with a company as prestigious as Anderson Enterprises. Surely, this had to be a mistake. But then her eyes drifted to the stack of unpaid bills on the counter. Her rent was due in a week. The electricity bill was overdue by 2. Her children deserved more than scraped-together meals and whispered reassurances. With a deep breath, she made her decision. Whatever this was, mistake or not, she couldn't ignore the possibility that it might change things. On the morning of the meeting, Janice pulled her best outfit from the closet. It wasn't much: a white blouse, slightly faded, and a black skirt she'd bought years ago. She ran her fingers over the fabric, smoothing out creases, then tied her hair back neatly. As she glanced at herself in the mirror, she whispered, "You've got this." She left her children with Mrs. Gardner, the kind elderly neighbor who always seemed happy to help, and caught the subway downtown. When she stepped off the train and stood in front of the towering glass building, she almost turned back. The structure loomed above her, intimidating and sleek, its reflective surface capturing the city's vibrant pulse. Janice forced herself to take a deep breath and pushed through the revolving doors. Inside, a receptionist with a polished smile greeted her. "Ms. Bowens? Welcome to Anderson Enterprises. Please follow me." Janice nodded, clutching her bag tightly as she followed the woman down a wide hallway. Everything sparkled: the floors, the walls, even the light fixtures. When they reached a large conference room, the receptionist gestured for her to enter. "Please make yourself comfortable. Mr. Anderson will be with you shortly." Janice stepped inside, her footsteps echoing faintly against the polished floors. The room was breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, while sleek black furniture gave the space an air of authority. She took a seat at the end of the long table, her fingers tracing the edge nervously. "What am I doing here? This has to be a mistake." The sound of the door opening behind her made her jump. She turned quickly, and froze. "Hello, Janice." Her mouth fell open. Standing before her, wearing a perfectly tailored suit, was Mike. But it wasn't the disheveled, weary Mike she'd met at her door. This man was polished and confident, his blue eyes sharp and focused. He smiled warmly, but Janice barely registered it. "Mike," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's going on?" He stepped further into the room, his hands clasped in front of him. "I owe you an explanation," he began. "My full name is Michael Anderson. I'm the CEO of Anderson Enterprises." Janice blinked, struggling to process his words. "CEO? Anderson Enterprises?" The man who had been at her door, hungry and disheveled, was the head of this massive corporation? Michael continued, his tone measured. "The night I came to your door wasn't an accident. I was conducting, let's call it an experiment. I wanted to understand what life is truly like for those who face challenges every day. To see the strength, resilience, and compassion that often go unnoticed." Janice's hands tightened around the strap of her bag. "So, you were testing me?" Not exactly, Michael said, his voice softening. I wasn't testing anyone. I was looking for something genuine. And that night, you showed me a kind of generosity and humanity I didn't expect. You had so little, yet you shared what you had. That stayed with me. Janice felt her face flush. I don't understand why I'm here. Why did you invite me? Michael smiled, pulling out the chair across from her and sitting down. Because I believe in rewarding the qualities that make a real difference. Empathy, determination, strength. You have those in abundance, Janice. And I think you'd bring something invaluable to this company. Her heart pounded in her chest. You're offering me a job? Yes, Michael said simply. An opportunity to work here, to grow, and to bring your perspective to the team. Janice stared at him, her mind racing. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like her. Why me? She finally asked, her voice trembling. There are so many people out there more qualified, more experienced. Because you deserve it, Michael interrupted gently. I've seen what you're capable of, and I believe in you. The rest? We can teach you. What we can't teach is the kind of heart you already have. For a moment, Janice couldn't speak. She felt a lump in her throat, a mix of disbelief and overwhelming gratitude. Finally, she managed, I don't know what to say. Michael smiled, standing up and extending his hand. Say yes. Let me help you change your life, Janice. Her hand trembled as she reached out to shake his. Okay, she whispered. Yes. As she left the building later that morning, clutching a folder filled with onboarding paperwork and a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years, Janice couldn't stop the tears that spilled down her cheeks. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to imagine a future where things might actually get better. Janice's first days at Anderson Enterprises were a whirlwind of emotions. Walking through the glass doors each morning felt surreal. The office, with its sleek lines and buzzing energy, was nothing like the cramped spaces of her past jobs. Yet, amidst her awe, there was an underlying fear of failing, of not living up to expectations, of proving the doubters right. Michael wasted no time pairing her with James Matthews, his loyal and meticulous assistant. From the start, James was direct but patient, breaking down the processes of the company in a way that Janice could absorb quickly. Here's your workstation, James said, leading her to a desk near a window. And here's your first assignment, reviewing client onboarding forms. It's straightforward, but it'll help you get familiar with how we operate. Janice nodded eagerly. I'll get started right away. James tilted his head, a faint smile breaking his usually serious demeanor. Don't rush. Take your time to understand everything. And if you have questions, ask. Michael's confidence in you means a lot, and I trust his instincts. That said, he paused, his tone softening, don't be too hard on yourself. No one expects perfection on day one. Those words settled some of the anxiety swirling in her chest. Janice sat at her desk and began. The forms were detailed but manageable. By the end of her first day, she had not only completed the task but also organized the files in a way that streamlined future processes. When James reviewed her work the next morning, his brow arched slightly in surprise. This is thorough, he said, flipping through the forms. And efficient. Janice smiled nervously. I thought it might make things easier for the next step. It does, James said, nodding. Well done. Keep this up, and you'll go far here. As the weeks passed, Janice proved herself invaluable. Her role started small, data entry, organizing schedules, and assisting in minor projects. But her natural ability to identify inefficiencies and propose solutions caught the attention of not only James but Michael as well. During one team meeting, a discussion arose about an ongoing project with a struggling client. The team debated strategies, each more complicated than the last, until Janice hesitantly raised her hand. What if we simplified the process instead, she suggested, her voice steady but quiet. The client's issue isn't complexity, it's clarity. If we focus on breaking down their priorities and tackling them one by one, we might regain their trust. The room fell silent for a moment before Michael spoke. She's right, he said, his tone firm. We've been overcomplicating this. Janice, can you draft a proposal based on your idea? Janice blinked, startled. Me? Yes, you, Michael replied with a small smile. I trust your instincts. Let's see what you can do. The proposal was a success. The client not only accepted it, but praised its simplicity and effectiveness. Michael commended Janice in the next team meeting, a moment that left her both proud and overwhelmed. At home, the changes were just as significant. The steady paycheck from her new job allowed Janice to breathe for the first time in years. She no longer had to choose between paying bills and buying groceries. Friday nights became pizza nights, much to Dwayne and Elizabeth's delight. Elizabeth, clutching a stuffed bunny Michael had gifted her, beamed as she declared it her new favorite day of the week. "Mom, does this mean we're rich now?" Dwayne asked one evening, his eyes wide with curiosity. Janice chuckled, ruffling his hair. "Not quite, sweetheart. But it does mean things are getting better." The little joys, Elizabeth's new coloring set, Dwayne's soccer ball, the occasional ice cream after school, were reminders of how far they'd come. Despite the progress, not everything was easy. Janice faced challenges that tested her resilience. One morning, she overheard two colleagues whispering near the coffee machine. "She's only here because of Michael," one said, her voice dripping with skepticism. "Do you really think someone like her got this job on merit?" Janice's stomach sank, but she kept walking, her face betraying none of the hurt. The whispers became an undercurrent she couldn't escape. It seemed that no matter how hard she worked, some people would always see her as an outsider. That evening, after putting the kids to bed, she sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at her hands. The doubts crept in, gnawing at the edges of her confidence. The next day, during her lunch break, Michael found her in the break room. "Janice," he said, his tone warm but concerned, "how are you holding up?" She hesitated, considering brushing it off, but something in his gaze encouraged honesty. "I'm doing my best," she admitted. "But I can't help feeling like I don't belong here. Like some people think I don't deserve to be here." Michael's expression hardened. "Listen to me," he said, pulling out the chair across from her and sitting down. "You're here because you earned it. Not because of me, not because of luck, but because you're talented and capable. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." His words resonated deeply, and for the first time in days, the weight on her chest felt lighter. One evening, after a particularly long day, Janice walked through her front door to find Elizabeth coloring at the table and Dwayne setting the dishes for dinner. "You're home," Elizabeth exclaimed, running to hug her. Janice knelt, holding her daughter tightly. "I missed you, baby." Dwayne grinned. "We're making spaghetti." "Well, sort of. It's the canned stuff, but still." Janice laughed softly. "Sounds perfect." As they sat down to eat, Janice felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Her life was far from perfect, but it was moving forward. And yet, in the back of her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that her challenges at Anderson Enterprises were only beginning. Richard Caldwell was not the kind of man to let obstacles go unchecked, and Michael Anderson had been a thorn in his side for years. For Richard, business wasn't just about profit, it was about power and control. When he noticed Janice Bowens rising within Anderson Enterprises, he saw an opportunity. Her story intrigued him, a single mother with no corporate background, suddenly trusted by Michael Anderson himself. Richard's instincts told him she could be a vulnerability, a crack in the armor he'd been trying to penetrate for years. One afternoon, as Janice left the building after a late meeting, Richard stood waiting near the sidewalk. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his posture exuding confidence. His smile seemed friendly, but his eyes were sharp, assessing her with a predator's precision. "Mrs. Bowens," he called out, stepping closer. Janice paused mid-step, startled. She didn't recognize him immediately, but sensed something disconcerting in his demeanor. "Yes? Can I help you?" "I've heard so much about you," Richard said, extending a hand. Richard Caldwell. The name struck her like a bell. She knew who he was, a competitor to Michael, known for his ruthless tactics. She hesitated, but shook his hand briefly. "I know who you are," she said, her tone cautious. Richard chuckled, a low, calculated sound. "Good. That saves me the trouble of introductions. I've been following your impressive rise at Anderson Enterprises. Michael must see something special in you." Janice stiffened, unsure of his intentions. "If you're trying to flatter me, Mr. Caldwell, it's unnecessary. I'm late to pick up my kids." She moved to walk past him, but he stepped into her path, blocking her. "Forgive me," he said smoothly, "but I have a proposal you might want to hear. One that could change your life." "I'm not interested," she replied, her voice firm as she tried to sidestep him again. Not so fast, Richard said, his smile tightening. Think carefully, Mrs. Bowens. A position with me could guarantee that you never have to worry about money again. Imagine the life you could provide for your children. No more scrimping, no more stress. Janice stopped abruptly, turning to face him fully. I won't betray my principles or my loyalty to Michael for anyone, she said, her tone cold. Richard's smile faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of irritation. Then he laughed, a short, humorless sound. Principles are admirable, Mrs. Bowens, but they don't pay the bills. And loyalty. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping. Loyalty is fragile. It breaks when pushed hard enough. Janice's eyes narrowed, her voice unwavering. You don't know me, Mr. Caldwell. And you don't scare me. For a brief moment, Richard's mask slipped, revealing the hardness beneath. We'll see how long that confidence lasts, he said, his tone icy. Without another word, Janice walked away, her back straight and her head high, though her heart was racing. She could feel his gaze burning into her as she disappeared into the crowd. When she arrived home that evening, her hands were still trembling slightly from the encounter. She tried to push the unease aside as Elizabeth ran to greet her. "Mommy, you're late," Elizabeth said, wrapping her arms around Janice's waist. "Sorry, sweetheart," Janice said, kneeling to kiss her daughter's forehead. It was a busy day. Dwayne appeared in the doorway, holding a notebook. "Did you get to see the new client proposal? You said you would explain it to us." Janice smiled, grateful for the grounding effect of her children. "I did. And I'll tell you all about it over dinner." As the evening went on, she replayed the conversation with Richard in her mind. Something about his approach left her uneasy, not just his persistence, but the way he spoke about loyalty and breaking it. She couldn't help but wonder what he was planning. The next morning, Janice entered the office determined to focus on her work. But as she settled at her desk, James Matthews approached, his expression serious. "Janice," he said, lowering his voice, "can we talk in private?" She followed him to a quiet corner of the office. "What's going on?" James glanced around before speaking. "I heard something concerning. Richard Caldwell's been asking questions about you. I thought you should know." Janice felt her stomach drop. "What kind of questions?" "He's been digging, trying to find out personal details. He's also been talking to some of our suppliers and partners. Nothing overtly threatening, but it's enough to raise flags." Janice clenched her fists. "He approached me yesterday. Tried to offer me a job." James's brow furrowed. "What did you say?" "What do you think?" she said, her voice tinged with frustration. "I told him no." James nodded, but his concern didn't ease. "Be careful, Janice. Richard doesn't take no for an answer. And if he can't manipulate you directly, he'll find another way." That evening, Michael called Janice into his office. The blinds were drawn, and his normally composed expression was strained. "Janice," he began, motioning for her to sit, "I've been informed that Richard Caldwell has taken an interest in you." "I told him I'm not interested," she said quickly. "I know," Michael replied. "That's not what worries me. Richard is persistent and dangerous. He's been trying to undermine this company for years, and now he sees you as a way to get to me." Janice's jaw tightened. "I won't let him use me against you, Michael. I'll do whatever it takes to protect this job, and my family." Michael studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I believe you. But we need to be proactive. I'll have James monitor any unusual activity, and I'll personally handle Richard if he tries anything else. Just stay vigilant." "Always," Janice said, meeting his gaze. As she left his office, Janice couldn't shake the feeling that Richard was only beginning his game. And she knew she'd have to be ready for whatever came next. The tension in the office was palpable. It started subtly, short glances in the break room, conversations that abruptly stopped when Janice entered. But soon, it became more obvious. A colleague would lower their voice when she passed by, another would exchange knowing looks with a coworker. The whispers followed her like a shadow. Janice tried to ignore it at first, burying herself in her work. She met every deadline, took on additional tasks, and continued to impress Michael and James with her efficiency. But no matter how hard she worked, the looks and murmurs didn't stop. One afternoon, Janice overheard two colleagues near the printer. They weren't even trying to hide their conversation. "I heard she only got this job because of Michael," one said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Of course, the other replied. Why else would he pick someone with no real experience? It's obvious she's his favorite. Janice's chest tightened, and her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She wanted to confront them, to demand they say it to her face, but she knew it wouldn't help. Instead, she returned to her desk, trying to push the anger down. That evening, as the office emptied out, Janice stayed behind, pretending to organize files but really avoiding the humiliation of facing her colleagues in the elevator. She sat at her desk, her head in her hands, when Amanda Reynolds, one of the few people who had been kind to her, walked over. "Hey Janice," Amanda said gently, pulling up a chair. "You've been awfully quiet lately. Everything okay?" Janice hesitated, then sighed. "No, it's not." Amanda waited patiently, her expression full of concern. "They're talking about me," Janice admitted finally. "They think I got this job because of Michael. That I don't deserve to be here." Amanda's face darkened. "Who's saying that?" "It doesn't matter," Janice said quickly. "It's not just one or two people, it feels like everyone. I can feel their judgment every time I walk into a room." Amanda crossed her arms, leaning back slightly. "You know this isn't about you, right? This is Richard's doing." Janice frowned. "Richard?" "Yes," Amanda replied firmly. "He's spreading these rumors to make you look bad. To make Michael look bad. He knows how much Michael values you, and he's using that against both of you." Janice's stomach sank. "But why? Why go after me? I'm just doing my job." Amanda sighed, her expression softening. "Because you're an easy target, Janice. You're new, and you're close to Michael. That makes you vulnerable. Richard wants to destabilize the company, and he's willing to take you down to do it." Janice sat back in her chair, the weight of Amanda's words pressing down on her. "I didn't ask for any of this," she said quietly. "I know," Amanda said, reaching out to touch her arm. "But you can't let him win. You've worked too hard to let some petty gossip derail you." Janice nodded, her resolve hardening. "Thank you, Amanda. I needed to hear that." Amanda smiled. "Anytime. And if you need someone to back you up, you know where to find me." The next morning, Janice arrived at the office determined to keep her focus on her work. But as the day went on, the whispers only seemed to grow louder. By lunch, she couldn't take it anymore. She went to Michael's office and knocked on the door. "Come in," he called. Janice stepped inside, closing the door behind her. Michael looked up from his desk, immediately noticing the tension in her posture. "Janice," he said, setting down his pen. "What's wrong?" She hesitated, then blurted out, "They're talking about me. Everyone. They think I'm only here because of you." Michael's expression darkened. "Who's saying that?" "I don't know exactly," she admitted. "But it's everywhere. I can feel it." Michael leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. "This is Richard's work. I should have seen this coming. What do we do?" Janice asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "I can't keep working like this, Michael. It's unbearable." Michael stood and walked to the window, staring out at the city. "We fight it," he said finally. "We let your work speak for itself. You've already proven your value here, Janice. They can whisper all they want, but the results don't lie." Janice nodded, but her doubt lingered. What if that's not enough? Michael turned to face her, his expression firm. "It will be. And I'll make sure of it. Richard won't get away with this." That night, Janice stayed up late, staring at her laptop. She combed through her projects, double-checking every detail, every report. If they wanted to question her abilities, she would leave them no room for doubt. But as she worked, a nagging thought tugged at the back of her mind. Richard Caldwell wasn't the kind of man to stop at rumors. Amanda had said he was trying to destabilize the company, and Janice couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. She closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. How far would Richard go to get what he wanted? And was she ready to face whatever came next? The tension in the office reached a boiling point. Whispers that once lingered in corners now followed Janice openly. She could feel the stares as she walked down the hall, conversations abruptly halting as she passed. Even James Matthews, who had always been kind and supportive, seemed colder, offering only curt nods in passing. Janice couldn't help but feel like a pariah. No matter how hard she worked, it seemed the shadow of doubt cast by the rumors was impossible to escape. Her once strong resolve was starting to crack under the weight of scrutiny. One morning, as Janice reviewed a client report at her desk, an email from Michael Anderson's assistant popped up on her screen. Janice, Michael would like to see you in his office at 10:30 a.m. Please let me know if this works for you. Janice stared at the screen, her stomach tightening. Michael rarely called her for unscheduled meetings. Something about the tone of the email felt heavy, as if the weight of the office gossip had finally reached him too. At 10:30 sharp, she stood outside his office, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands before knocking. "Come in," Michael's voice called from inside. She stepped in, closing the door softly behind her. Michael sat behind his desk, his usual confident posture replaced by one of quiet tension. His hands were clasped in front of him, his expression thoughtful yet serious. "Janice," he said, motioning for her to take a seat. She complied, her heart pounding. "Is everything okay?" Michael leaned back slightly, his eyes fixed on hers. "We need to talk," he began, his tone measured. "I've noticed the shift in the office, how people have been treating you." Janice felt her throat tighten. "I've noticed too," she admitted quietly. "I didn't want to bring it up, but it's hard to ignore." Michael nodded, his expression softening slightly. "The rumors, they're not just about you. They're about us. People are saying you only have your position because of me." Her chest constricted, the shame and frustration bubbling to the surface. "I don't know how to stop it," she said, her voice trembling. "I've been doing my job, working harder than ever, but it feels like nothing I do matters. They've already made up their minds." Michael sighed, his hands tightening into fists momentarily before he released them. "This isn't your fault, Janice. I'm almost certain this is Richard's doing. He's trying to undermine us both, sowing doubt and discord. It's his strategy, divide and conquer." Janice hesitated before speaking. Maybe I should leave." The words came out reluctantly, as if they physically hurt her to say. "I don't want to cause problems for you or the company. If stepping away would make things easier." "No," Michael interrupted firmly, leaning forward. "Don't even think about it." She looked at him, startled by the intensity in his voice. "You've earned your place here, Janice," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "Your work speaks for itself. You didn't get here because of me. You got here because you're talented, determined, and exactly what this company needs. I won't let Richard, or anyone else, drive you away." Janice felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but quickly blinked them away. His words were a balm to the wounds the rumors had left, but doubt still lingered. "What if it doesn't stop?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if they never stop looking at me like I don't belong?" Michael's expression softened, his tone becoming gentle but resolute. "Then we'll make them see the truth. Together. But leaving? That's not an option. Not for you. Not for me." She nodded slowly, the knot in her chest loosening just slightly. Michael's belief in her was a lifeline she hadn't realized how much she needed. "Thank you," she said quietly. Michael gave her a small smile. "You don't have to thank me. You've earned this, Janice. And you're not alone in this fight." Despite Michael's reassurances, Janice couldn't shake the unease that lingered. As she returned to her desk, she noticed James standing near the coffee machine, his gaze flickering toward her before he quickly looked away. Her stomach twisted. "Janice," Amanda's voice broke through her thoughts. Her friend was walking toward her, concern etched on her face. "Hey," Janice said, forcing a smile. "Michael just talked to you, didn't he?" Amanda asked, her voice low. "How did you know?" "Because he's worried," Amanda said simply. "And he should be. Richard is turning up the heat. I've heard things. He's been spreading stories, planting doubts in people's minds. It's working." Janice exhaled sharply. "What am I supposed to do, Amanda? How do I fight something I can't even see?" "You keep doing what you've been doing," Amanda said firmly. "You work hard, you prove them wrong. And you let Michael handle Richard. He knows how to play this game better than anyone." Janice nodded, though the knot in her stomach remained. That evening, after the office emptied out, Michael sat in his chair, staring at the city lights through his window. James entered the room quietly, closing the door behind him. "We need to act," James said without preamble. "I know," Michael replied, his voice steady. "But not yet. Richard's trying to provoke us. If we retaliate too soon, we'll play right into his hands." James hesitated. "And Janice? She's caught in the middle of this." Michael turned, his expression hardening. I won't let Richard destroy her. Or this company. Whatever his next move is, we'll be ready. But even as he spoke, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was only beginning, and that Richard's next move would be the most dangerous yet. Richard Caldwell sat in his sprawling corner office, the city skyline glowing through the expansive windows behind him. The space exuded wealth and power, every detail meticulously chosen to intimidate. But Richard was uninterested in his surroundings at the moment. His focus was on the pile of documents spread across his mahogany desk. Each report, email, and financial statement had been obtained through less than ethical channels. To Richard, ethics were a triviality, a tool for those too weak to wield real power. His sharp eyes darted over the papers, his mind weaving a web of strategy. They're vulnerable, Richard said finally, his voice cutting through the silence. Across from him, his assistant, a young woman named Valerie, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She wasn't new to Richard's schemes, but there was something about his tone that made her uneasy. Are you sure this will be enough to take them down? She asked cautiously, gesturing to the documents. Richard leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. This isn't just about taking them down, he said, his voice low and deliberate. I don't want to merely defeat Michael Anderson. I want to destroy him. Valerie's unease grew, but she kept her expression neutral. And Janice Bowens? She's the key, Richard said, his eyes narrowing. Michael's invested in her, both personally and professionally. If we can make it look like she's involved in something corrupt, something big, it'll create a ripple effect. The board will question his judgment. The public will question his integrity. And Janice will be ruined in the process. Valerie hesitated. Do you think people will buy it? She doesn't exactly have a history of wrongdoing. That's precisely why it'll work, Richard said, his tone sharp. The best lies are the ones that twist the truth. We'll make it seem like she's part of something bigger, something she couldn't resist. A struggling single mother desperate to climb the ladder? It's a narrative people will believe, because it's exactly what they expect. He picked up a sleek black folder and slammed it shut with a sharp crack, the sound echoing in the room. Prepare the contacts in the press. I want this story ready to leak by the end of the week. Valerie nodded, though her discomfort was evident. And if Michael fights back? Richard smirked, leaning forward. Let him. The more he struggles, the guiltier he'll look. This isn't just a game, Valerie. It's a dismantling. By the time I'm done, there won't be anything left of Michael Anderson's empire, or his little protege. Hours later, Richard stood by the window, nursing a glass of whiskey. The city below was alive, lights flickering like tiny stars. He didn't see beauty in it, only opportunity. He thought back to his long-standing rivalry with Michael. Michael was everything Richard despised, principled, respected, a man who played fair and still succeeded. That success was a slap in Richard's face, a reminder that his own rise to power had been built on manipulation and deceit. But Michael had a weakness now, Janice Bowens. She was his Achilles heel, the one variable Richard could exploit. The next morning, Valerie returned to Richard's office with a folder of her own. I've compiled the preliminary dossier, she said, setting it on his desk. Richard opened it, scanning the contents. It was a carefully constructed narrative, blending truth and fiction seamlessly. We'll imply she's been funneling sensitive information to competitors, Valerie explained. Nothing outright stated, but enough to raise suspicion. And with her connection to Michael, it'll reflect poorly on him as well. Richard nodded, satisfied. Good. Now, add a layer of financial misconduct. Make it look like she's using her position for personal gain. The more threads we weave, the harder it'll be for them to untangle. And the press? Valerie asked. I've already lined up a few willing participants, Richard said with a smug grin. They'll run the story without asking too many questions. The scandal will spread like wildfire before Michael even knows what hit him. Later that day, Richard made a call to one of his media contacts. I have a story for you, he said, his tone dripping with confidence. Let's just say it involves Anderson Enterprises, a certain CEO, and an employee who's not as innocent as she seems. The journalist on the other end chuckled. I'm listening. Richard outlined the fabricated narrative, careful to leave enough ambiguity to protect himself while ensuring maximum damage. When he finished, the journalist was practically salivating. This will be front-page material, the journalist said. That's the idea, Richard replied, his grin widening. Just make sure it's out before the week is over. As the days passed, the groundwork for Richard's plan fell into place. The rumors about Janice, already circulating within Anderson Enterprises, began to take on a new life outside the office. Whispers turned into leaks, leaks into speculative articles, and soon, the internet was buzzing with chatter about a potential scandal brewing at Anderson Enterprises. Richard watched it all unfold with satisfaction, his trap carefully set. He knew Michael and Janice would fight back, but he also knew that in the court of public opinion, perception was everything. By the time the truth came out, if it ever did, it would already be too late. And as he poured himself another glass of whiskey that evening, Richard couldn't help but smile. For the first time in years, he felt like he was finally one step ahead of Michael Anderson. In the days following the initial wave of whispers, the atmosphere in Anderson Enterprises grew increasingly oppressive. What had started as office gossip was now something far more sinister. Anonymous emails began circulating, accusing Janice of influencing high-level decisions without the proper qualifications. The accusations hinted at nepotism, claiming that Michael's trust in her was misplaced and that it was affecting the company's integrity. Janice felt the shift acutely. The glances from her colleagues, once skeptical, now seemed hostile. Conversations ceased whenever she entered a room, and the silence was deafening. But the tipping point came when manipulated reports surfaced, alleging that contracts handled by Michael and Janice had financially benefited third parties with questionable ties. During an emergency meeting in Michael's private conference room, the tension was palpable. Seated around the table were Michael, James, Amanda, and Janice. A stack of the so-called evidence sat in the middle of the table like a ticking bomb. "This is absurd." Michael exploded, slamming his fist on the table. "These accusations are baseless, and the documents are obviously doctored." "They're doctored, yes," Amanda said carefully, her brow furrowed as she reviewed the reports. "But they're also incredibly convincing. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. If this gets out, it could destroy not only the company's reputation but yours as well, Michael." Michael's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing in frustration. "Who benefits from this?" "Richard. It has to be him." James nodded in agreement. "The timing is too perfect. He's playing the long game, waiting for this to reach the press. The question is how we contain it." Janice, sitting quietly until now, finally spoke, her voice steady but strained. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said, looking directly at Michael. "You believe me, don't you?" Michael turned to her immediately, his expression softening. "Of course I believe you, Janice. I know your character. But this isn't about what's true, it's about what people think is true. And right now, Richard is manipulating everyone into questioning your integrity." The words stung, not because they were untrue, but because they highlighted the helplessness of the situation. "What do we do?" Janice asked, her voice tinged with desperation. "We fight," Michael said firmly. "James, I need you to trace the origin of these reports. Find out who created them and how they got circulated. Amanda, I want you to start crafting a response strategy. If this reaches the press, we need to be ready to counter it immediately." "And me?" Janice asked, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Michael hesitated for a moment. "For now, I need you to keep a low profile. Stay out of the spotlight. Let us handle this." Janice's heart sank at his words. She understood the logic, but the thought of withdrawing made her feel like she was admitting guilt. "Staying quiet will only make me look guilty," she said softly. Michael's eyes met hers, a flicker of regret in his expression. "I know. But until we have proof to clear your name, we can't risk giving Richard more ammunition." The meeting adjourned, but the weight of it lingered as Janice returned to her desk. Her inbox was flooded with routine emails, but each one felt like a reminder of her tenuous position. She glanced around the office, noticing the way her colleagues avoided her gaze. "Janice," Amanda's voice startled her. Amanda had followed her out of the meeting and now stood by her desk, her expression sympathetic. "Hey," Janice said weakly. "You okay?" Amanda asked, though she already knew the answer. "Not really," Janice admitted, forcing a bitter laugh. "I feel like I'm walking on a tightrope, and everyone's just waiting for me to fall." Amanda pulled up a chair, lowering her voice. "Listen, this isn't your fault. Michael's right, it's Richard. He's orchestrating this whole thing, and he's damn good at it. But you've got people here who believe in you. Don't forget that." Janice gave a small nod, though her confidence wavered. "Thanks, Amanda. I don't know how much more of this I can take." Meanwhile, James dove headfirst into the investigation. He combed through internal communications, looking for anomalies, and traced the metadata on the leaked reports. It was a painstaking process, but James was methodical, leaving no stone unturned. Late one evening, he approached Michael's office, holding a folder tightly in his hands. Michael looked up from his desk, his face lined with exhaustion. "Tell me you have something," Michael said. "I'm getting close," James replied, setting the folder down. "Whoever did this covered their tracks well, but there are subtle inconsistencies in the document origins. I've identified a few external IP addresses that might lead us to whoever sent the anonymous emails." Michael leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "And the reports?" "Definitely forged," James confirmed. "The financial figures were altered to make it look like Janice, and by extension you, benefited from kickbacks. But I'll need more time to prove who's behind it." Michael exhaled slowly, his frustration evident. "Do whatever it takes, James. I don't care how much it costs or how long it takes. Find me the proof we need." As the week progressed, the pressure on Janice grew. She overheard more whispers, caught more judgmental stares. Every interaction felt like a test of her endurance. One afternoon, while reviewing client files in the break room, two colleagues entered, speaking in hushed tones. "I'm telling you, there's no way she's innocent," one said. "Michael's protecting her," the other replied. "He has to be. Why else would he keep her around?" Janice clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to scream to defend herself, but instead, she quietly left the room, her head held high despite the tears threatening to spill. That evening, Michael called Janice into his office again. "How are you holding up?" he asked, concern evident in his tone. Janice hesitated before answering. "Barely," she admitted. "I feel like I'm drowning, Michael. Everywhere I go, people look at me like I don't belong here. Like I'm some kind of fraud." Michael stood and walked around his desk, standing in front of her. "Listen to me," he said, his voice firm. "You don't have to prove yourself to them. You've already proven yourself to me, and that's what matters. We're going to fix this, Janice. I promise." She nodded, the determination in his voice giving her a sliver of hope. But as she left his office, she couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was far from over, and that Richard's plan was only just beginning. Janice's afternoon was already strained with deadlines and the weight of the office's gossip when her email pinged with a new message. The sender's address was untraceable, just a string of random characters. "I have information you need. Meet me at the cafe on 5th Street at 3 p.m. You'll want to hear this. It could clear your name." Her heart raced as she read it. She knew it was a bad idea. Anonymous emails weren't exactly trustworthy, and this could easily be a trap. But what if it wasn't? What if someone had real information that could help her and Michael fight back? Against her better judgment, she grabbed her coat and left the office. The cafe on 5th Street was quiet, the mid-afternoon lull leaving only a handful of customers scattered among the tables. Janice hesitated in the doorway, scanning the room. In the back corner, she spotted a familiar figure sitting casually, a cup of coffee in hand. Richard Caldwell. He looked up and smiled when their eyes met, waving her over as though they were old friends meeting for a pleasant chat. "Janice," he said warmly as she approached. "I'm so glad you decided to come." She stopped a few feet away, keeping her distance. "You sent the email?" Richard tilted his head, his smile never faltering. "Let's say I arranged it. I thought we could have a private conversation." "Sit, please." He gestured to the chair across from him. "I'm not staying," Janice said coldly. "If you have something to say, say it." Richard sighed dramatically, leaning back in his chair. Always so defensive. "I'm not your enemy, Janice. In fact, I might be the only one who can help you." "I don't need your help," she snapped. "Don't you?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Because from where I'm sitting, things aren't looking too good for you. The rumors, the reports, the questions about your qualifications. It's only a matter of time before this all blows up." Janice crossed her arms, her glare unwavering. "You're the one spreading those lies." "I know it." Richard chuckled softly. "Lies? That's such a harsh word. Let's call it reframing the narrative. But that's not why we're here." He leaned forward, his expression shifting from smug to serious. "I wanted to give you an out. An out. Janice repeated, her tone laced with disbelief. Yes, Richard said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You don't have to go down with the ship, Janice. Work with me. I can make all of this go away. Janice laughed bitterly. You expect me to believe that? I expect you to consider your options, he said smoothly. Michael can't protect you forever. He's too busy trying to save himself. But I can. Align with me, and I'll make sure you come out of this unscathed. Maybe even better off than you are now. She shook her head, taking a step back. I'm not interested. You can't manipulate me like you manipulate everyone else. Richard's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. You should reconsider. Or what? Janice shot back. He leaned forward again, his voice quiet but menacing. Or the rumors about you and Michael will seem like a playground spat compared to what I can do. I can make sure your name is smeared so thoroughly that you'll never work again. I can ruin Michael's reputation and yours along with it. And if that's not enough, well, you have kids, don't you? Janice's hands balled into fists, her blood boiling. You leave my children out of this. Richard smirked, his confidence unshaken. That's entirely up to you. Work with me, Janice. Play smart, and we can both win. For a moment, fear and rage battled within her. Then she straightened, her voice steady. You can't intimidate me, Richard. He chuckled, the sound low and cruel. Oh, I can. The real question is, how far are you willing to go to protect your family? Janice glared at him for a long moment, then turned and walked away without another word. As she made her way back to the office, Richard's words echoed in her mind. The threat against her children was a line she hadn't expected him to cross, and it terrified her. But she couldn't let him win. When she returned to her desk, Amanda was waiting for her, concern etched on her face. Where have you been? Amanda asked in a hushed tone. Janice hesitated before answering. I had a meeting. With who? Amanda pressed. Richard, Janice admitted quietly. Amanda's eyes widened. What? Janice, are you out of your mind? Why would you meet with him? He sent an anonymous email, Janice explained. I thought maybe, just maybe, he had real information. And? Janice sank into her chair, her hands trembling. He offered me a deal. Said he could make all of this go away if I worked with him. Amanda's expression darkened. That bastard. What did you say? I told him no, Janice said firmly. Good, Amanda said, her voice filled with resolve. But Janice, you need to tell Michael about this. Janice hesitated. I don't want to cause more problems for him. He needs to know, Amanda insisted. Richard isn't going to stop, and if he's threatening you, it's only a matter of time before he escalates. Janice nodded slowly. You're right. I'll talk to Michael. That evening, Janice stood outside Michael's office, her heart pounding. She knew she had to tell him about the meeting with Richard, but part of her feared how he would react. Taking a deep breath, she knocked on the door. Come in, Michael called. Janice stepped inside, bracing herself for the conversation to come. James Matthews moved swiftly through the office, the flash drive in his pocket feeling heavier with every step. The data he'd uncovered had been buried deep, layered behind firewalls, fake accounts, and encrypted transactions. But persistence was James's greatest strength, and after weeks of digging, he finally had something solid. When he reached Michael's office, he didn't bother to knock. He pushed the door open, startling Michael, who looked up from a pile of documents on his desk. James, Michael said, noting the urgency in his assistant's face. What is it? James pulled the flash drive from his pocket and handed it over. You're going to want to see this. Michael raised an eyebrow as he inserted the drive into his laptop. Within seconds, the screen filled with spreadsheets, transaction logs, and emails, evidence that painted a damning picture. What am I looking at? Michael asked, though his instincts already told him this was tied to Richard Caldwell. Proof, James said, pulling up a chair next to Michael. These are financial records from several shell companies that Richard controls. He's been funneling money into these accounts and using it to finance the smear campaign against you and Janice. Anonymous tips, fake reports, doctored documents. It's all coming from him, and this is how he's paying for it. Michael's jaw clenched as he scanned the data. This is it. This connects him directly to everything. It's strong evidence, James agreed. But it's not enough to take him down completely. Richard's smart, he's got layers of protection, and he's well-connected. If we move too soon, he'll find a way to wriggle out of it. Worse, he might retaliate harder than ever. Michael leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. His anger simmered beneath the surface, but he knew James was right. Richard wasn't just another rival. He was a seasoned manipulator with allies in high places. "We need something bigger," Michael said finally, his tone measured but steely. "Something so irrefutable that even his most powerful allies can't protect him. I want every loose end tied up, James. Leave no room for doubt." James nodded, his determination matching Michael's. "I'll keep digging. There's more out there, I know it. I'll find it." Michael's eyes burned with resolve. "Do whatever it takes. I don't care how long it takes or how much it costs. We're ending this." Across the office, Janice sat at her desk, staring blankly at her computer screen. The words in the email she was drafting blurred together, her mind clouded by the weight of everything that had happened. The rumors, the accusations, Richard's threats, they were suffocating her. Her inbox pinged with another message. This one was innocuous, a client inquiry, but even the smallest task felt monumental in the shadow of the chaos surrounding her. Amanda appeared at her desk, pulling up a chair without invitation. "Janice," she said gently, "how are you holding up?" Janice hesitated, then let out a heavy sigh. "I feel like I'm in a constant state of freefall. Every time I think I've found solid ground, something else happens. I don't even know who I can trust anymore." "You can trust me," Amanda said firmly. "And Michael. He's fighting for you just as much as he's fighting for the company. You know that, right?" Janice nodded, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "I know. But it doesn't make it any easier." Amanda placed a reassuring hand on Janice's arm. "We're going to get through this. You've come too far to let Richard win." That evening, Michael asked Janice to meet him at his apartment. He'd arranged for her children, Dwayne and Elizabeth, to be dropped off there earlier, knowing she'd feel more at ease with them close by. When Janice arrived, she found her children fast asleep on the couch, their small bodies curled up beneath a cozy blanket. She knelt down, brushing Elizabeth's hair back and kissing her forehead. "They're safe here," Michael said from the doorway, his voice low. Janice looked up at him, her expression a mix of exhaustion and gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. Michael nodded, motioning for her to join him in the kitchen. He poured them each a glass of water and leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. "How are you holding up?" Janice took a sip of water before answering. "I don't even know anymore. Every day feels like a fight to prove I belong here. And then there's Richard," she trailed off, her hands tightening around the glass. Michael's jaw tightened. "What did he say to you when you met him?" Janice hesitated, then recounted the meeting at the cafe. She told him about Richard's threats, his veiled comments about her children, and his offer to make the rumors go away if she worked with him. Michael's expression darkened with every word. By the time she finished, his anger was palpable. "He threatened your kids?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Janice nodded, her voice trembling. "He didn't outright say it, but the implication was clear. He'll do whatever it takes to break me, and you." Michael set his glass down with a sharp clink, his fists clenching at his sides. "That bastard has crossed every line imaginable. I've been trying to play this smart, to be patient, but enough is enough. He's not just a threat to the company anymore, he's a threat to the people I care about." Janice's breath caught at his words, but she quickly pushed past the emotion. "Michael, we can't let him win. I've made my decision, I'm not running. I don't care what he throws at me, I'm staying and fighting this with you." Michael stepped closer, his gaze locking onto hers. "You're not in this alone, Janice. Whatever happens, we're facing it together. Richard messed with the wrong people, and he's going to regret it." They stood there for a moment, the unspoken resolve between them growing stronger. But as the night settled over the city, neither of them realized that Richard was already preparing his next move, a devastating blow that would push them both to their limits. The new week began with chaos. Janice woke to the buzzing of her phone, a barrage of notifications lighting up the screen. Groggily, she unlocked it and was immediately confronted with a headline splashed across every major news outlet. "Scandal at Anderson Enterprises. Favoritism and conflict of interest expose prohibited relationship." Her heart sank as she clicked the link, her stomach churning with dread. The article was vicious, filled with salacious claims that painted her as a manipulative opportunist who had seduced her way into the company. The accusations were backed by damning evidence, contracts that appeared to show favoritism toward her, coupled with photos of her and Michael from company events, deliberately cropped and edited to look intimate. The narrative was clear. Janice had allegedly been in a romantic relationship with Michael long before her hiring, and she had used that relationship to gain special treatment and financial perks. Janice stared at the screen, her breath catching in her throat. The comments section was worse than the article itself. Classic gold digger move. Anderson Enterprises is a joke now. She should be fired immediately. Her hands trembled as she scrolled, the words cutting deeper with every passing second. At Anderson Enterprises, Michael was already in full damage control mode. His office buzzed with activity as his legal team and PR specialists worked to contain the fallout. This is blatant defamation, Michael shouted, pacing behind his desk. Those contracts are fabricated, and the photos are clearly doctored. How is this even being published without fact-checking? It's the nature of the beast, his lead PR strategist replied grimly. In this digital age, sensationalism spreads faster than truth. By the time we debunk these claims, the damage will already be done. Michael stopped pacing, running a hand through his hair. We need to issue a statement. Make it clear that these allegations are false and that Janice earned her position on merit. That won't be enough, James interjected, his tone serious. Richard is behind this. He's too clever to leave obvious holes in his story. We need proof, undeniable proof, that he orchestrated this attack. Michael nodded, his frustration evident. Then find it. I don't care what it takes. In the middle of the chaos, Michael's assistant knocked hesitantly on the door. Sir, she said, peeking inside, your mother is here. She says it's urgent. Michael sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Send her in. Olivia Anderson entered the room, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Her expression was a mix of anger and concern, and she wasted no time getting to the point. This is what happens when you mix business with your personal life, Michael, she said, her voice sharp. The company is now the center of a public scandal, and our reputation may never recover. Michael faced her, his expression unyielding. Janice hasn't done anything wrong, and you know it. Perception is reality. Olivia snapped. It doesn't matter if the accusations are false. People believe them, and that belief can destroy everything we've built. Michael's jaw tightened. So what's your solution? Throw her under the bus? Let Richard win. Olivia sighed deeply, her tone softening but her stance firm. The board is already calling for an emergency meeting. They're demanding you step down temporarily until this is resolved. Michael's frustration boiled over. Step down? That's exactly what Richard wants. If I leave now, it'll look like I'm admitting guilt. This isn't about what's fair, Michael, Olivia said, her voice quieter now. It's about survival. The board won't back you if you keep fighting this head-on. If you don't agree to step aside, they'll force you out permanently. Michael stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. He felt trapped, his back against the wall. I won't abandon Janice, he said firmly. She's innocent, and I'm not going to let her take the fall for this. I'm not asking you to abandon her, Olivia said. But think strategically. Protecting the company protects her too. If the board sees you as a liability, they'll cut ties with both of you. Michael didn't respond immediately. He turned to look out the window, his hands clenched into fists. He knew Olivia was right about the board, but the thought of stepping aside felt like conceding to Richard. After a long silence, he finally spoke. I'll consider it, he said, his voice tight. But I need time to figure out how to do this without leaving Janice vulnerable. Meanwhile, Janice sat in her small apartment, scrolling through the endless stream of articles and comments. Her phone buzzed constantly, calls and messages from reporters, former colleagues, even distant acquaintances she hadn't spoken to in years. She ignored most of them, but when Amanda called, she picked up immediately. Janice, Amanda said, her voice filled with urgency. Are you okay? No, Janice admitted, her voice breaking. I feel like my life is falling apart. I know it's overwhelming, Amanda said gently. But you can't let this break you. Michael's working on a plan to clear your name. You just have to hold on a little longer. I'm not sure how much longer I can hold on, Janice said quietly. Everywhere I look, people are calling me a liar, a cheat. I can't even walk into the office without feeling their judgment. Then don't, Amanda said suddenly. What? Take a few days off, Amanda suggested. Focus on your kids, on yourself. Let Michael and the team handle the fallout for now. You don't have to face this alone. Janice hesitated, the idea both appealing and terrifying. I don't want to abandon Michael. You're not abandoning him, Amanda reassured her. You're giving yourself the space you need to stay strong. You can't fight this battle if you're completely drained. Janice nodded slowly, realizing Amanda was right. Okay, she said finally. I'll take a step back. But only for a little while. As Janice prepared to focus on her children and regroup, Michael stayed up late into the night, strategizing his next move. He knew the battle ahead would be brutal, but he also knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't let Richard Caldwell destroy everything he built, especially not Janice. What neither of them realized was that Richard's next move was already in motion, and it would test their resolve like never before. While Michael wrestled with the fallout of the scandal, Janice sat in her apartment, staring at her laptop. The relentless headlines, accusatory comments, and the growing mountain of lies weighed heavily on her. But beneath the exhaustion, a spark of determination ignited. She couldn't keep relying on others to fight her battles. If she wanted to clear her name and protect Michael, she had to take action herself. Grabbing her phone, she called Amanda. Amanda, can you meet me at my apartment? Janice asked, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Of course, Amanda replied without hesitation. I'll be there in 20. When Amanda arrived, she found Janice surrounded by stacks of papers, her laptop open with multiple tabs displaying Anderson Enterprises files. Janice, Amanda said, concern etched on her face. What's going on? You look like you haven't slept. I haven't, Janice admitted, motioning for Amanda to sit. But I need your help. I think I've figured out how to fight back. Amanda sat down, her brow furrowed. Tell me what you're thinking. It's Richard, Janice said, her voice firm. He's behind everything. The rumors, the fake documents, the smear campaign, it all traces back to him. But he couldn't have done it alone. Someone in his circle must have slipped up, and if we can find that mistake, we can expose him. Amanda nodded, her expression sharpening with determination. Okay. What do you need from me? You have contacts in the corporate world. People who've dealt with Richard before, Janice said. I need to know if anyone has information about his methods, his allies, or even just a hint of something we can follow. If we find a crack, we can pull the whole thing apart. Amanda tapped her chin thoughtfully. I can make a few calls. But this won't be quick. People don't like talking about Richard. He's burned a lot of bridges, but he still has power. Do whatever it takes, Janice said. I'll keep digging on my end. 4 hours, Janice and Amanda combed through old contracts, employee files, and archived communications. They pored over every detail, looking for anything that seemed out of place. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Amanda's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and her eyes widened. What is it? Janice asked, her voice tinged with urgency. One of my contacts just sent me something, Amanda said, opening the email. It's, oh my God, Janice. Look at this. She turned her phone toward Janice, who leaned in to read. It was an internal email sent by one of Richard Caldwell's closest advisors. The subject line alone sent a chill down her spine. Regarding the Anderson strategy. Janice read aloud. Ensure the forged documents are indistinguishable from legitimate records. We can't afford any mistakes. She looked up at Amanda, her eyes wide. This is it. This proves the documents were faked. Amanda nodded, her voice steady. It's good, but it's not enough. We need something that ties Richard directly to this. Right now, it's just his advisor's word. Undeterred, the two women continued their search, enlisting James for his expertise. Together, they analyzed metadata from the fake reports, traced email chains, and dug into Richard's financial records. After hours of painstaking work, James sat back in his chair, a triumphant smile on his face. Got it, he said, spinning his laptop toward them. What is it? Janice asked, leaning over the screen. This, James said, pointing to a series of transactions. These payments were made to the same printing firm that produced the fake documents. The money came from one of Richard's shell companies. Amanda's eyes lit up. That's a direct link. He paid for the forgery. Exactly, James said. And it gets better. The The printing firm kept detailed invoices, including instructions that match the content of those fake reports. Richard's name is all over it. Janice felt a surge of hope, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. This could be what we need to prove he orchestrated everything. As the team compiled their findings, Janice couldn't help but feel a flicker of optimism. For the first time in weeks, it felt like they were no longer just defending themselves, they were on the offensive. But even as the evidence mounted, Janice knew they couldn't get complacent. Richard wasn't the type to back down easily, and the stakes had never been higher. "We have to move carefully," she said, looking at Amanda and James. "Richard's not going to go down without a fight. If he realizes we're onto him, he'll escalate." "We'll be ready," Amanda said firmly. Janice nodded, her resolve hardening. "Let's finish this." What they didn't know was that Richard was already aware of their investigation. And as they pieced together the evidence to take him down, he was preparing a devastating counterstrike that would leave them scrambling to keep up. Michael Anderson knew that Richard Caldwell thrived on theatrics, so he used that to his advantage. Choosing the most opulent restaurant in the city, a place frequented by the elite, Michael ensured their meeting would take place under the watchful eyes of the influential. If Richard wanted to gloat, he would have an audience. Michael arrived first, dressed in a tailored suit that matched the understated elegance of the venue. As he waited, sipping a glass of whiskey, he reviewed his strategy. This wasn't a meeting to win the battle, it was about reading his opponent and identifying his weaknesses. When Richard entered, his presence was as calculated as always. He strode confidently through the restaurant, his perfectly tailored suit and smug smile signaling that he owned the room. Heads turned, whispers followed, and Richard basked in it all. "Michael," Richard greeted, sliding into the chair across from him. "I must admit, I'm surprised you reached out. It's not like you to negotiate from a losing position." Michael returned his smile, calm and collected. "You misread the situation, Richard. I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here to understand how far you're willing to go before you fall apart." Richard chuckled, leaning back in his chair. Bold words for a man whose company is teetering on the edge of scandal. Or should I say, your scandal? Michael didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "You're good at this, Richard. I'll give you that. But even the best make mistakes. And when they do, they fall the hardest." "Is that a threat?" Richard asked, feigning amusement. "An observation," Michael replied smoothly. Their waiter approached, briefly interrupting the exchange to take their orders. Michael barely glanced at the menu before requesting a simple steak. Richard, on the other hand, took his time, as if relishing the opportunity to flaunt his sophistication. Once the waiter left, Richard leaned in, his expression turning sharp. "You can play the righteous leader all you want, Michael, but we both know how this ends. I have the resources, the connections, and the influence to outlast you. The press will bury you and your little pet project. What's her name? Ah, Janice. How noble of you to defend her. A real white knight." Michael's jaw tightened slightly at the dig, but he maintained his composure. "It's interesting how much effort you've put into tearing her down. Is it because you're afraid of what she represents? Someone who didn't claw their way to the top by stepping on others." Richard's smirk faltered for a brief second before he recovered. "Afraid? Hardly. I'm simply ensuring that obstacles are removed before they become problems." "Obstacles?" Michael echoed, his voice cold. "Is that what you think of people? Tools to manipulate or destroy as it suits you?" Richard shrugged. "It's business, Michael. You've been in this long enough to know there's no room for sentiment." Michael leaned back in his chair, studying Richard carefully. "That's your problem, Richard. You think everything's a transaction. But here's the thing about people, they don't forget. You can buy loyalty, but you can't buy trust. And when the tide turns, you'll find yourself very alone." Richard's expression darkened, his confident facade cracking just slightly. "You seem awfully confident for someone who's losing the PR war. How long do you think you can keep this up? The board is already questioning your judgment. How long before they push you out?" Michael smiled faintly, his calm demeanor unnerving Richard. "I suggest you enjoy this moment, Richard. Savor it. Because when this ends, and it will, you'll wish you'd taken a different path." Their meeting was brief, but it left an impression. As Richard strode out of the restaurant, still exuding confidence, Michael remained seated, his mind dissecting every word and gesture. Michael's takeaway was clear: Richard thrived on control. Every word he spoke, every move he made was calculated to assert dominance. But Michael had also noticed something else, a hint of impatience, a need to escalate the situation quickly. That impatience would be his downfall. Michael pulled out his phone and sent a message to James. Set up the next phase. Richard's pushing hard, and he'll slip soon. Be ready to catch it. The next morning, Michael gathered his core team, James, Amanda, and Janice, into a private meeting room at the office. Janice, though visibly tired, had regained some of her determination after their recent breakthroughs. Richard's on edge, Michael began, pacing in front of the group. Last night confirmed it. He's pushing hard because he knows we're getting close. But that also makes him vulnerable. What did he say? Amanda asked. Michael's lips curled into a faint smirk. Enough to confirm that he's desperate to maintain control. He's overreaching, which means it's only a matter of time before he makes a mistake we can exploit. James leaned forward, tapping his pen against the table. We've already got evidence tying him to the forged documents and the smear campaign. If he slips further, we'll have enough to dismantle his entire operation. Janice listened intently, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. What's the next step? We keep the pressure on, Michael said. But we also need to be prepared for whatever he throws at us next. He won't go down without a fight, and he's still dangerous. Amanda glanced at Janice. And you? Are you ready for this? Because Richard won't just target Michael anymore. He's going to come after you harder than ever. Janice straightened in her seat, her voice steady. Let him. I'm not afraid of him anymore. Michael stopped pacing and looked at her, his expression softening. Good, he said. Because this isn't just about protecting the company anymore. It's about showing Richard that he can't destroy people for his own gain. We're not just fighting for Anderson Enterprises, we're fighting for something bigger. The room fell silent for a moment as the weight of Michael's words settled over them. As the team finalized their strategy, Richard was already putting his next move into motion. But this time, his impatience and overconfidence would set the stage for his undoing. The tension in the room was palpable as Janice, Amanda, and James pored over their findings, the quiet hum of their computers the only sound. Michael stood nearby, his arms crossed, his sharp gaze focused on James's screen as he meticulously traced Richard Caldwell's financial movements. Each transaction, each data point, was a potential link to the truth they desperately needed. There, James said suddenly, pointing to the screen. Look at this. Amanda leaned over, her brow furrowed. A $75,000 payment to Riverbend Media. What's that? Small-time media company, James replied, already typing rapidly to dig deeper. Guess what they published 2 weeks ago? Janice's stomach dropped. The article, she whispered. The one that started everything. Exactly, James confirmed, pulling up a list of the company's recent publications. Riverbend Media ran the initial hit piece with the fabricated documents. This payment came from one of Caldwell's shell companies 3 days before the story broke. Michael's jaw tightened, his anger barely contained. That's no coincidence. Keep going. James nodded, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Let me see if I can find a direct link. There. He leaned closer to the screen, excitement creeping into his voice. The payment included a memo, consultation for article distribution. He paid them to publish the piece. Amanda let out a low whistle. That's big. But we need more, something concrete that shows Caldwell was behind the fake documents, not just the article. The team worked late into the night, their determination unwavering. By the early hours of the morning, James finally leaned back in his chair, exhaustion etched into his face but triumph gleaming in his eyes. I got a hit, he said. Michael immediately stepped forward. What is it? I tracked down a contact within Riverbend Media, James explained. Someone anonymous, but they were willing to talk. They confirmed that the documents used in the article were delivered directly from Richard Caldwell's office. No verification, no fact-checking, they just published what he gave them. Janice's hands covered her mouth as relief and disbelief washed over her. We have him, she said, her voice trembling. Amanda exhaled deeply, a wide smile breaking across her face. This is what we needed. This is the smoking gun. Michael, ever cautious, studied the information. It's a strong lead, he said, but it's not enough to completely dismantle him. We need to take this to the next level. The following afternoon, Michael called the team into a private conference room. On the table sat a folder containing everything they had compiled: financial records, email trails, and the anonymous statement from the journalist. "This is good," Michael began, addressing the group. "But we need to go public in a way that leaves no room for doubt. If we release this quietly, Richard will spin it, and we'll lose control of the narrative. So what's the plan?" Amanda asked, leaning forward. "We need to make a statement that's loud enough to drown out everything else," Michael said. "A press conference, backed by hard evidence. We expose Richard in front of the world, with everything laid out so clearly that even his allies can't save him." Janice hesitated, her voice quiet but firm. "If we do that, he'll retaliate. He's not going to go down quietly." Michael met her gaze. "He's already thrown everything he has at us, Janice. This is our chance to hit back harder." Amanda nodded in agreement. "It's risky, but it's the only way to put an end to this." The team spent the next 48 hours meticulously preparing. James worked tirelessly to ensure their evidence was bulletproof, cross-referencing every detail. Amanda coordinated with trusted media contacts, ensuring that the press conference would receive maximum coverage. Janice focused on her role in the presentation, determined to show the world that she was not the person Richard had painted her to be. Despite her nerves, she knew this was her moment to reclaim her dignity and protect the people she cared about. On the morning of the press conference, Michael gathered the team for a final briefing. "This is it," he said, looking at each of them. "We've worked too hard and come too far to let him win. Stick to the facts, stay composed, and let the truth do the rest." Janice took a deep breath, nodding. "We're ready." Michael smiled faintly. "Yes, we are." Meanwhile, across the city, Richard Caldwell sat in his office, unaware of the storm about to descend upon him. His confidence remained unshaken, but for the first time he sensed a shift, an unease he couldn't quite place. The chess game was nearing its climax, and the next move would determine everything. The anticipation in the room was palpable as reporters from across the city filled the conference hall. Camera crews adjusted their equipment, journalists whispered amongst themselves, and every eye was fixed on the podium at the front of the room. The event, called on short notice by Anderson Enterprises, had drawn significant attention, thanks to the rumors swirling around Michael and Janice. Behind the curtain, Michael stood with Janice, Amanda, and James. Michael's expression was calm, but his focus was razor-sharp. Janice, on the other hand, was visibly nervous, her hands gripping a folder containing the evidence they were about to reveal. "You'll do great," Michael said, his voice steady as he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "This is our moment to set the record straight." Janice nodded, drawing a deep breath. "I'm ready," she said, though her heart raced. The room quieted as Michael stepped up to the podium, the bright lights casting sharp shadows across his face. He scanned the crowd for a moment before speaking, his voice firm and commanding. "Thank you all for being here today," Michael began. "For weeks, Anderson Enterprises has been the target of baseless accusations, fueled by false narratives and fabricated evidence. Today, we're here to present the truth." He gestured toward the large screen behind him, where James began projecting a series of documents. The first was an email chain, the subject line reading, "Regarding the Anderson strategy." "This," Michael said, pointing to the screen, "is the first piece of evidence that ties Richard Caldwell directly to the smear campaign against this company and my employee Janice Bowens." The room murmured with interest as Michael continued. "This email chain shows Caldwell's advisor instructing the publication of falsified documents to discredit both Anderson Enterprises and Ms. Bowens. The documents were never authenticated, yet they were used to launch a targeted attack on our integrity." James clicked to the next slide, revealing the financial records. "Here we see direct payments from Caldwell's shell companies to Riverbend Media, the publication that ran the initial article. These payments were made under the guise of consultation fees, but the timing and purpose are clear." The reporters began scribbling furiously in their notebooks, some raising their hands to ask questions, though Michael motioned for them to wait. "This isn't just about false accusations," Michael continued, his voice rising with conviction. "This is about an orchestrated attempt to undermine not only my leadership, but also the hard work of an innocent employee." He stepped back slightly, nodding to Janice. "Ms. Bowens, would you like to say a few words?" Janice hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward. The room seemed to close in around her as dozens of eyes fixed on her. Swallowing her nerves, she spoke, her voice shaky at first but growing steadier with each word. "When I joined Anderson Enterprises, I did so because I wanted to build a better life for my children, she began. I worked hard, just like so many others, to prove myself and contribute to something meaningful. To be accused of dishonesty and manipulation, things I would never do, was devastating. She paused, her hands gripping the edges of the podium. But I'm here today because I refuse to let lies define me. The evidence we've shown proves that this campaign wasn't about exposing the truth. It was about power and control. Richard Caldwell tried to destroy my reputation and my career, but I won't let him win. The room was silent for a moment before the first question came. Ms. Bowens, a reporter asked, standing, "How has this experience impacted you personally?" Janice steadied herself. "It's been one of the hardest experiences of my life. The lies spread about me didn't just hurt my career, they hurt my family. My children saw the headlines, heard the whispers, and felt the judgment. But I've learned that truth is the strongest weapon against injustice, and that's what we're standing on today." Another reporter raised their hand. "Mr. Anderson, do you believe Caldwell acted alone in this scheme?" Michael stepped back to the podium. "Richard Caldwell is a man who thrives on alliances, but his ego has led him to make mistakes. While we can't speak to the involvement of others at this time, we're committed to uncovering every connection and ensuring accountability." As the press conference continued, the reporter's initial skepticism began to waver. The evidence was undeniable, and the story quickly shifted from an accusation against Anderson Enterprises to a takedown of Richard Caldwell. By the time the event ended, the room was abuzz with journalists rushing to publish their articles. Headlines shifted almost immediately. Caldwell accused of orchestrating smear campaign. Anderson Enterprises reveals evidence of document forgeries. Janice Bowens fights back, the truth behind the scandal. Backstage, Janice let out a shaky breath as Michael approached her. "You did it," he said softly. "We did it," Janice corrected, a small smile breaking through her exhaustion. Amanda joined them, her phone in hand. "The coverage is everywhere already. Caldwell's name is trending, for all the wrong reasons." Michael's expression darkened slightly. "He's not going to go down without a fight. This isn't over yet." "No," Janice agreed, her resolve stronger than ever. "But now, we have the truth on our side." Across town, Richard Caldwell sat in his office, his face twisted with fury as he watched the press conference unfold. The evidence was damning, and the narrative was slipping out of his control. Slamming his fist on the desk, he barked at his assistant, "Get me everything we have on Anderson and Bowens. If they want a war, I'll give them one." The chess game had reached its breaking point, and both sides prepared for the final moves. The press conference had concluded, and Janice, still reeling from the emotional weight of her speech, stepped out into the cool evening air with Amanda and James by her side. Michael lingered behind, speaking with a few reporters who had follow-up questions. For the first time in weeks, Janice felt a fragile sense of relief. As they walked toward the car waiting for them, a figure emerged from the shadows of the parking lot. Richard Caldwell. His sharp suit was immaculate as always, but his expression was anything but polished. His face was twisted in rage, his movements tense as he approached them. Amanda noticed him first. "Janice," she said under her breath, her voice low with warning. Janice turned, freezing momentarily when she saw him. His presence radiated anger, his eyes narrowing as he closed the distance between them. "You think you've won?" Richard growled, his voice low but filled with venom. "You think this little stunt of yours is enough to take me down?" James stepped forward, his posture protective. "You should leave Caldwell," he said firmly. "This isn't the place or the time." But Richard ignored him, his focus locked on Janice. "Do you even understand what you've done?" he sneered. "You've made yourself a target. Do you think Michael can protect you from what's coming?" Janice's pulse quickened, but she didn't back down. The fear that had once paralyzed her was gone, replaced by a growing resolve. "No, Richard," she said, her voice steady and firm. "I think you're the one who doesn't understand. This isn't just about me or Michael. This is about the lies you've told, the people you've hurt, and the consequences you've tried to avoid for too long. It's over for you." Richard took a step closer, his expression darkening further. "You don't get to decide when this ends," he hissed. "I do." Janice squared her shoulders, standing her ground. "No, Richard. You're finished. And you know it." For a moment, Richard's facade cracked. The mask of control he so carefully maintained faltered, replaced by raw, unfiltered fury. But before he could say another word, the sound of Michael's voice cut through the tension. "That's enough, Caldwell." Richard turned sharply to see Michael approaching, his calm but commanding presence instantly shifting the balance of power. Michael's expression was cold, his eyes locked on Richard with unflinching intensity. "You've lost," Michael said bluntly. "And if you have any sense left, you'll leave now and prepare for what's coming." Richard scoffed, his confidence returning in the face of Michael's challenge. "You think a press conference and some doctored evidence are enough to beat me? You're more naive than I thought." Michael didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he took another step closer, his voice dropping low. "You're done, Richard. You just don't know it yet." For a long moment, the two men stared each other down, the tension thick enough to cut. Then, without another word, Richard turned and stalked away, his footsteps echoing in the parking lot. Later that evening, as Janice returned home, she couldn't shake the feeling that Richard's parting words were a threat. Though she was proud of how she had stood up to him, a small part of her worried about what he might try next. Michael called her shortly after. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "I'm fine," Janice said, though her voice betrayed her lingering unease. "But Richard." "He looked ready to explode, Michael. I think he's desperate." "That's exactly what we need him to be," Michael replied. "Desperate people make mistakes. And he just made his biggest one." "What do you mean?" "James tipped off the authorities earlier today," Michael explained. "Everything we found, the financial records, the forged documents, the payments to Riverbend Media, it's all been handed over. They've been building a case against Richard for weeks. And now, they have everything they need." Janice's breath caught. "Do you think it'll be enough?" "It will be," Michael said confidently. "By tomorrow morning, Richard Caldwell will finally face the consequences of his actions." The next morning, the offices of Caldwell Enterprises were a scene of chaos. Employees whispered nervously as a team of federal agents arrived, armed with search warrants. Boxes of documents were seized, hard drives were removed, and the once unshakable empire Richard had built began to crumble. Richard, who had been in a meeting when the agents arrived, stormed into his office, his face a mask of fury. "What is the meaning of this?" he barked, confronting the lead agent. The agent, unflinching, handed him a copy of the warrant. "We have evidence tying you to multiple counts of fraud, market manipulation, and conspiracy. You'll need to come with us." Richard's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, a way to regain control. But there was none. The weight of his actions had finally caught up with him. As the agents escorted him out of the building in handcuffs, cameras flashed, and reporters shouted questions. The headlines that followed were relentless. Richard Caldwell arrested in massive fraud scandal. Corporate titan falls. Caldwell taken into custody. Justice served. Evidence links Caldwell to forged documents and smear campaign. Back at Anderson Enterprises, Janice and Michael watched the news unfold from his office. Amanda and James joined them, the atmosphere one of cautious celebration. "It's over," Amanda said, leaning back in her chair with a satisfied smile. "Not yet," Michael corrected. "This is just the beginning. Richard's arrest is a victory, but there's still work to do to rebuild trust, with our clients, our employees, and the public." Janice nodded, her expression thoughtful. "And I still have to prove to myself that I deserve to be here. But at least now, I have the chance to do that without someone trying to tear me down." Michael looked at her, his gaze steady. "You've already proven yourself, Janice. To me, to the team, and to everyone who matters. The rest will come in time." She smiled, a sense of relief washing over her. For the first time in weeks, the weight she had been carrying felt lighter. But as the dust settled and the team began to plan their next steps, one thing was clear: while they had won this battle, the road ahead would still be challenging. They would need to navigate the aftermath carefully, and together, they would ensure that the truth prevailed. With Richard Caldwell behind bars and the truth exposed, the tides began to turn for Michael, Janice, and Anderson Enterprises. The headlines that once fueled suspicion now hailed their resilience and integrity. Though the damage caused by the scandal wouldn't vanish overnight, the team worked tirelessly to repair the fractures in trust and morale. For Janice, the change was most apparent in the office. Where once she had endured whispers and judgmental stares, she now found smiles and nods of encouragement. Some colleagues even stopped by her desk to offer apologies. "I just wanted to say," one junior associate said awkwardly, shifting from foot to foot, I I was wrong to believe all that stuff about you. I'm sorry. Janice smiled kindly. Thank you. That means a lot. Amanda, who had become Janice's closest confidant, made sure every small victory was celebrated. Another apology? That's 3 this week, Amanda said with a grin, dropping a coffee cup on Janice's desk. At this rate, you'll be giving forgiveness workshops by Friday. Janice laughed, her gratitude for Amanda's unwavering support evident. I couldn't have gotten through this without you. Damn right, Amanda said playfully. But you're the one who showed everyone your strength. I just handed you the occasional coffee and pep talk. At home, Janice's children also felt the shift. Dwayne and Elizabeth had been shielded from the worst of the scandal, but they had noticed their mother's stress. Now, they saw her smile more, laugh more. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Dwayne asked, "Mom, are things better at work now?" Janice paused, her heart swelling at her son's concern. "Yes, sweetie," she said, her voice soft. "Things are much better." Elizabeth beamed. "Does that mean we can have pizza night again?" Janice laughed, her eyes glistening with unshed tears of relief. "Yes, baby. We can have pizza night." But one of the most significant moments of healing came in the form of an unexpected visit from Olivia Anderson. Michael's mother, who had been one of Janice's harshest critics during the ordeal, requested to meet with her privately. Janice was nervous at first but agreed, knowing it was an opportunity for closure. When Olivia arrived at Janice's office, she didn't waste time with pleasantries. Instead, she closed the door behind her and turned to face Janice with a composed but genuine expression. "Janice," Olivia began, her tone steady but laced with regret, "I owe you an apology." Janice blinked, caught off guard. Olivia continued, "When you first came to this company, I doubted you. I judged you, not on your abilities or your character, but on assumptions I had no right to make. And when the scandal broke, I let those assumptions cloud my judgment even further." Janice opened her mouth to respond, but Olivia raised a hand gently. "Please, let me finish. Watching you over the past few weeks, seeing how you've handled yourself, with grace, resilience, and integrity, it's clear to me now that I was wrong. You're stronger than I ever gave you credit for, and you've more than earned my respect." Janice felt a lump rise in her throat. She took a moment to gather herself before speaking. "Thank you, Olivia. That means more than you know. This wasn't easy, for any of us. But I think it's made us all stronger." Olivia nodded, her expression softening. "If there's anything I can do to support you moving forward, please don't hesitate to ask. Just knowing I have your support now is enough," Janice said sincerely. The two women exchanged a smile, and as Olivia left, Janice felt a weight lift. Meanwhile, Michael worked tirelessly to restore the company's reputation externally. He spent hours in meetings with clients, assuring them of Anderson Enterprises' integrity and commitment to excellence. Slowly but surely, the trust that had been shaken began to rebuild. During one particularly late night at the office, Michael stopped by Janice's desk on his way out. She was still working, her desk illuminated by the soft glow of her computer screen. "You should go home," Michael said, leaning against the edge of her desk. Janice glanced up, a small smile playing on her lips. "You should take your own advice." Michael chuckled. "Fair point. But seriously, you've been working non-stop. Don't burn yourself out." "I'll head out soon," Janice promised. "I just want to finish this report." Michael hesitated for a moment, then said, "You've been incredible through all of this, Janice. I hope you know that." Janice's cheeks flushed slightly, but she met his gaze. "Thank you, Michael. I couldn't have done it without you, or the team." Michael straightened, his smile warm. "Well, we're lucky to have you. Don't forget that." As the days turned into weeks, the office regained its usual rhythm, but the bonds forged during the crisis remained. Janice felt more connected to her colleagues and more confident in her place at Anderson Enterprises. One afternoon, as she and Amanda shared a quiet moment in the break room, Amanda raised her coffee cup in a mock toast. "To surviving scandals and proving the doubters wrong," Amanda said with a grin. Janice clinked her mug against Amanda's, her smile full of hope. "To new beginnings." Though the road ahead was still uncertain, Janice knew one thing for sure: she had faced the storm and come out stronger. And for the first time in a long time, she felt ready for whatever came next. The weeks following Richard Caldwell's downfall brought a rare sense of calm to Michael and Janice's lives. With the chaos behind them, the trust between them deepened, and their bond grew stronger in ways neither had fully anticipated. Their moments together, once fraught with tension and urgency, had taken on a quieter, more meaningful rhythm. They worked seamlessly at Anderson Enterprises, but it was the time outside the office that began to truly transform their connection. One Friday evening, Michael invited Janice to dinner at a small, intimate restaurant on the edge of the city. The setting was quiet, the kind of place where conversations felt sacred, and the world outside seemed far away. As they settled into their table, Michael couldn't help but notice how relaxed Janice looked, her smile no longer weighed down by fear or worry. "Thank you for coming," Michael said, his voice soft as he poured her a glass of wine. Janice chuckled. "You act like I'd say no. You've seen my schedule. I needed a break just as much as you." Michael smiled, but didn't respond right away. Instead, he studied her for a moment, his expression contemplative. "What?" Janice asked, tilting her head. "You," he said simply. "I was just thinking about everything we've been through. How much you've been through. And how incredible you've been through it all." Janice's cheeks flushed, but she rolled her eyes playfully. "You give me too much credit, Michael. I had my moments of doubt, plenty of them. Maybe," Michael conceded, leaning forward slightly. "But you never let those moments define you. You faced everything head-on, even when it felt impossible. I admire that about you." Janice looked down at her hands, a soft smile spreading across her face. "You're part of the reason I didn't give up. Knowing you believed in me, it kept me going." For a moment, the table fell quiet, the weight of their shared journey filling the space between them. Then, Michael reached across the table, his hand resting gently on hers. "Janice," he began, his voice lower now, "you've become more than just someone I work with. You've shown me what strength and integrity really look like. You've reminded me why I started all of this in the first place. Not just to build a company, but to build something meaningful." Janice's heart skipped as she met his gaze. Michael took a breath before continuing. "Through everything, the scandals, the fights, even the moments when it felt like we might lose, you were the one constant. The one person I knew I could trust completely." He hesitated for only a second, then spoke with clarity and conviction. "Janice, you've been the reason all of this was worth it. I don't want to just leave it at that. I want to build something with you. A future. Together." Janice felt her eyes well with emotion. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came at first. Instead, she let out a small laugh, wiping at her eyes. "Yes," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Michael. I want that too." Michael's face broke into a rare, genuine smile, his relief and joy evident. As they left the restaurant later that night, the world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them. Their conversation shifted to lighter topics, plans for the future, dreams they hadn't yet dared to voice. "Elizabeth's already asking when she can visit the office again," Janice said with a laugh as they walked toward Michael's car. "She's welcome any time," Michael replied. "I'm thinking of making her an honorary board member. She's got the best ideas out of anyone I've met." Janice laughed, the sound bright and genuine. "Dwayne will want a title too. He'll probably suggest something like Chief Toy Officer." "I'll have James draft the paperwork," Michael said with a smirk. That night, as Janice returned home, she felt lighter than she had in years. Dwayne and Elizabeth were already asleep, and the apartment was quiet. She sat on the edge of her bed, replaying the evening's conversation in her mind. Michael's words stayed with her, filling her with a sense of hope and possibility. For so long, she had focused on surviving, on protecting her children and keeping her head above water. Now, for the first time, she could imagine a life where she wasn't just surviving but thriving. Across town, Michael sat in his study, a glass of scotch in hand. His thoughts were on Janice, on the promise they had made to one another, and on the path ahead. He felt a clarity he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose that went beyond the boardroom or quarterly reports. But as the night deepened, a nagging thought crept into his mind. Something felt unfinished, as though a piece of the puzzle was still missing. Unbeknownst to Michael or Janice, the remnants of Richard Caldwell's schemes were not yet entirely extinguished. Far from it, a critical revelation was lurking just out of sight, one that could upend everything they had fought so hard to build. Life at Anderson Enterprises had finally settled into a rhythm. The company was flourishing again, and Janice felt a sense of belonging she hadn't known in years. She and Michael had begun to carve out a future together, their partnership stronger than ever. But just as it seemed the turbulence was behind them, An unexpected revelation threatened to unravel everything. It was a quiet afternoon when James decided to clean out a cluttered storage cabinet in the office. The cabinet was filled with old contracts, reports, and miscellaneous paperwork dating back nearly a decade. As he sifted through the dusty folders, his hand brushed against a sealed envelope tucked in the back corner. The envelope was unmarked except for a handwritten name on the front, Michael Anderson. James frowned, curiosity piqued. The file cabinets were organized by department and date. There was no reason a personal envelope should have been mixed in with old contracts. After a moment of hesitation, he decided it wasn't his to open. Instead, he carried it directly to Michael's office. "Michael," James said as he entered, holding out the envelope. "I found this while going through some old files from 2015. It has your name on it, but I have no idea why it was there. I thought you should take a look." Michael leaned back in his chair, taking the envelope with a quizzical expression. "Thanks, James. I'll check it out." James nodded and left, leaving Michael alone with a mysterious envelope. Janice entered a few minutes later, carrying a folder of notes for an upcoming client meeting. "Michael, I wanted to go over the—" She stopped mid-sentence, noticing the way he stared at the document he had just pulled from the envelope. His face had gone pale, and his hand gripped the edge of his desk as though to steady himself. "Michael," she said, her voice tinged with concern. "What's wrong?" Michael didn't answer right away. He glanced up at her, his expression a mix of shock and disbelief. "Janice, you need to see this." He handed her the document and a handwritten letter that had been tucked inside the envelope. Janice sat down across from him, her brow furrowing as she read. The document was a detailed transfer of assets, outlining a hidden financial transaction from years ago. The attached letter, written in neat, elegant handwriting, revealed that Richard Caldwell had once been a major shareholder in Anderson Enterprises, under a pseudonym. Janice's hands trembled slightly as she finished reading. This can't be real," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Richard was part of your company?" Michael nodded grimly. "Not just part of it. He was one of the largest shareholders during a critical period. And according to this, he used his influence to manipulate our financial strategies, secretly steering us into risky ventures that weakened the company's position in key mergers." Janice set the papers down, her mind racing. "This explains so much. The difficulties you faced during those years, the deals that fell apart. It wasn't just bad luck. It was sabotage." Michael ran a hand through his hair, leaning back in his chair. He sold his shares just before his actions could come to light. That's why his name never appeared on any records. He covered his tracks perfectly and then continued his vendetta from the outside. "Why would he do this?" Janice asked, her voice filled with disbelief. Michael exhaled slowly. "This letter hints at a personal grudge. Years ago, Anderson Enterprises refused to merge with one of Richard's early ventures. Apparently, he saw it as a humiliation and vowed to take us down for it." Janice shook her head, trying to process the magnitude of the revelation. This wasn't just about power or profit. This was personal for him. Michael's eyes darkened. "It explains why he's been so relentless. He's been playing a long game, starting with sabotage from the inside and escalating to outright attacks once he left the company." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the discovery settling over them. Finally, Janice broke the silence. "This changes everything," she said. "If we can prove this, it not only solidifies your position but also shows the lengths Richard went to destroy you and the company." Michael nodded, his mind already racing. "We'll need to corroborate everything. Financial records, communications, anything that ties Richard to his pseudonym and these transactions. We should bring James in on this," Janice suggested. "He's already familiar with the financial patterns we've uncovered, and he can help us dig deeper." Michael agreed. "And Amanda too. She's great at finding connections others miss. If we're going to expose this, we need to do it thoroughly." That evening, Janice and Michael convened with James and Amanda in a secure meeting room at the office. Michael laid out the document and the letter, explaining everything they had discovered. Amanda's eyes widened as she read the letter. "This is insane," she said. "Richard was sabotaging Anderson Enterprises from within years before all of this started? How is that even possible?" James leaned forward, his analytical mind already working. "The pseudonym explains a lot. If he funneled his investments through shell companies or used proxies, it would have been nearly impossible to trace. But now that we know what to look for, we might be able to find evidence that connects him to those accounts. Michael nodded. That's our priority. If we can uncover the full scope of his involvement, it won't just clear our names. It'll dismantle whatever remnants of influence he still has. And it'll show the world exactly who he is, Janice added, her voice resolute. Amanda smiled at her. Looks like you've fully embraced being a fighter, Janice. Janice smiled back. After everything we've been through, I've learned you can't back down from people like Richard. As the team began their investigation, none of them could predict the ripple effects this revelation would create. Unraveling Richard Caldwell's web of deceit would uncover truths that extended far beyond Anderson Enterprises, truths that would shake the foundations of more than one powerful empire. And for Michael and Janice, the stakes had never been higher. The tension in the room was thick as Michael and Janice continued to pore over the newly uncovered documents. Every line they read reinforced the depth of Richard Caldwell's deception. Then Amanda's call shattered the relative calm, her voice urgent and breathless. Janice, Amanda began, barely able to catch her breath. You're not going to believe what I just found. What is it? Janice asked, gripping the phone tightly. I did a deeper dive into the shareholder records from when Richard was involved with Anderson Enterprises. I found something strange. Janice frowned. Strange how? Amanda hesitated. There's another name tied to the transactions that benefited Richard during that time. A name that doesn't make sense. Who? A long pause crackled through the line before Amanda finally answered. Olivia Anderson. The words felt like a punch to the gut. Janice's breath hitched. Olivia? Are you sure? I triple-checked, Amanda said. Her name shows up on at least 3 transactions tied to Richard's schemes. I don't know if she was directly involved, but she's connected, whether she knew it or not. Janice's hand trembled as she ended the call. Turning to Michael, she struggled to find the words. Michael, there's something you need to know. Michael looked up from the papers, his brow furrowing at the concern in her tone. What is it? Amanda found something, Janice said carefully. It's about your mother. Michael froze. My mother? What about her? She's tied to some of the transactions that helped Richard. It might be indirect, but it's there. For a moment, Michael didn't respond. Then slowly, he shook his head. No, that doesn't make sense. My mother, she's strict, she's tough, but she'd never, he trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Janice placed a hand on his arm. We don't know the full story yet, but we need to find out. If she was manipulated or coerced, we can help her. But if she knew more than she let on, Michael, we need the truth. That evening, Michael drove to his mother's home, Janice by his side. The drive was tense, neither of them speaking, both bracing for what they might discover. When Olivia answered the door, she immediately sensed the gravity of their visit. Michael, she said, her voice cautious. What's going on? Michael stepped inside, his expression unreadable. We need to talk. Olivia led them into the living room, where she sat down, folding her hands neatly in her lap. What is this about? Michael didn't waste time. Mom, he began, his voice steady but firm. Did you have any involvement with Richard Caldwell's schemes? Olivia stiffened, her eyes darting between Michael and Janice. For a long moment, she said nothing, the weight of the question hanging in the air. Finally, she exhaled deeply, her shoulders slumping. Not directly, she admitted. But, yes, I knew. Michael's jaw clenched. Knew what, exactly? Olivia looked down at her hands, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. Years ago, Richard approached me when you first took over the company. He framed himself as an ally, someone who wanted to help expand the business. I was naive. I believed him. I thought I was protecting the company, protecting you. Michael's voice rose, incredulous. You let him manipulate you? You let him sabotage us. I didn't know what he was doing at first. Olivia shot back, her composure cracking. By the time I realized the truth, it was too late. He threatened me, Michael. He said he'd expose secrets that would destroy our family. I thought staying silent was the only way to protect us. Michael stood, pacing the room, his emotions a whirlwind of anger and betrayal. You knew, and you said nothing. You let me fight him for years, thinking I was facing him alone. Olivia's eyes filled with tears. I didn't know how to fix it, Michael. I was scared. And I didn't want to burden you with my mistakes. Janice, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke. "Olivia," she said gently but firmly, "this is your chance to make things right. Whatever happened in the past, we have an opportunity now to bring everything into the open and put an end to this." Olivia turned to Janice, her expression filled with regret. "You're right. I've spent too long running from this. It's time I took responsibility." The next morning, Olivia called a press conference. The Anderson family name carried weight, and her decision to address the scandal directly drew significant attention. Standing at the podium, Olivia took a deep breath before addressing the crowd. "I'm here today to speak about my past involvement, or lack of action, regarding Richard Caldwell's activities within Anderson Enterprises. While I was never directly involved in his schemes, my silence allowed him to manipulate our company in ways I deeply regret." Her voice trembled but grew steadier as she continued. "I should have spoken up. I should have protected my son, Michael, and the employees who trust us to lead with integrity. My inaction was a failure, and for that, I take full responsibility." The room was silent as she finished, the weight of her confession hanging heavily. Michael and Janice watched from the back of the room. Janice reached for Michael's hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "She's doing the right thing," Janice said softly. Michael nodded, though his expression was conflicted. "It doesn't erase what happened, but it's a start." With Olivia's confession and Richard Caldwell facing a lengthy legal battle, Anderson Enterprises found itself on solid ground once more. The company's reputation was restored, and its leadership was stronger than ever. Michael and Janice, now married, led the company together with a renewed sense of purpose. Their journey had been fraught with challenges, but it had also forged an unbreakable bond between them. At home, Dwayne and Elizabeth thrived, their laughter filling the halls. Michael had embraced his role as a stepfather, becoming a source of steady support and love for the children. Olivia, now retired from the business world, dedicated herself to her family. She spent her days doting on her grandchildren, determined to make up for the time lost to ambition and mistakes. One evening, as Michael and Janice sat on their porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Janice reflected on their journey. "Do you ever think about how all this started?" she asked, leaning into Michael's side. Michael smiled, wrapping an arm around her. "Every day," he said. "I never imagined that knocking on your door that night would change my life." Janice laughed softly. "And I never imagined that opening it would change mine." They sat in comfortable silence, their hearts full of gratitude for the trials that had brought them to this moment. Their story was one of resilience, love, and the power of truth to overcome even the darkest of adversities. Together, they faced the future, knowing they could conquer anything, because they already had.
If you've made it this far, then subscribe to the channel and leave a comment.